Bless you. All right. We stopped at Missouri Compromise. And sectional tensions are starting, if you've noticed, each part of the country has its own agenda. They have their own personal interests. Well, we're going to have our first real crisis revolving around those different identities in the Missouri Compromise. So in 1819, Missouri is grown enough that it has over 60,000 people. It's ready to become a state. At this point, there are 11 slave states and 11 free states. Most of the northern states have ended slavery, not all of them, but slavery is definitely on its way out north of Pennsylvania. Let's see if we can find a good map, or a map that actually shows Missouri. This one does, but not well. Let's see if I can get it. There we go. Sorry about that. More that way. All right. So Missouri is pretty much all of this, but not all of that is going to become Missouri. At least not all of that becomes the state. This down here is unorganized. Arkansas and Louisiana were part of the Louisiana Purchase, but they've become states. Okay, this is Missouri. But in 1819, everything here up is in Missouri. Well, here up, this is the Arkansas territory. But they're ready to make it a state. The boundary between slavery had been the southern and western boundary between Pennsylvania and Ohio. But nothing had been said up until this point about what are we going to do about slavery in this new territory. Slave owners had been taking slaves there. People had been moving from the south in. St. Louis had become a funnel for settlers moving west. A lot of them were slave-owning Southerners. But in 1819, the House was asked to approve legislation for Missouri to draft a state constitution. It's time to make it a state. James Talmadge, Jr. of New York, proposed a resolution prohibiting the transportation of any more slaves into Missouri. Estimates are there were already around 10,000. And providing for freedom at 25 to slaves born there after statehood. So what he's offering is if you have a slave, you get to keep your slave, if your slave has a child, you can use that child as a slave until they're 25. This obviously didn't set well with the slave owners or most of the Southerners, but it still passes the House. New York has grown so much, and the northern population has outstripped the southern population, that representation in the House is no longer equal. We might have 11 slave states and 11 free states, but when it comes down to representation by population, the North has the South beat, and it's not going to change. So they can pass things in the House, but they can't pass them in the Senate. And when it goes to this vote in the Senate, there's even some northern senators that oppose it. So Talmadge's proposal fails, but it gets everybody's ire up. People are starting to realize that this is going to be a kind of a make or break it issue. At the same time, Maine applies for statehood. Now, Maine is up here. It had been part of Massachusetts, even though it's not contiguous. It was part of Massachusetts. But they want to be their own state. They wanted to be their own colony. They lost out on that, but they want to be their own state. Obviously, it's going to come in as a free state. Light bulbs start going on. Okay, we can handle this. We'll add one slave state and we'll add one free state. It'll all stay even. We don't have to talk about the elephant in the room that we don't want to talk about. But it doesn't quite go that easily. The Senate proposed to allow both of the states to come in, but they add an amendment to that, or an extension to that, to set a border. They're going to exclude slavery north of 3630, which is Missouri. This part always confused me. It's called the Missouri Compromise. You can't have slavery above 3630, but that's Missouri's southern border. You're going to have slavery above it because Missouri's coming in as the slave state. So they're saying that any new states that are going to be added after Missouri comes in, any of this green area is going to be slave-free. No slaves above this line, except here. You can have slaves here above the line. That's the compromise, which guarantees this area is going to be a slave state. The slave states think they've won because the Arkansas Territory will probably come in as two different states. It might come in as one, but it's doubtful. So that's going to give them 2 more votes. And most people looked at this area as the Great American Desert, where nobody wants to live. And even though it's a much bigger area and can be chopped up into many, many more states, in 1819, no one ever felt like it was going to get enough population to become a state. The slave states think they've won. So it passes the House on March 2nd, 1820. And they're almost ready to say, okay, good, we've avoided this controversy. But then Missouri writes their constitution. And their constitution excludes free blacks and mulattoes from the state, which is a clear violation of Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, which says the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all of the privileges and immunities of the citizens of the several states. So if you can be a citizen in Virginia, you can be a citizen in New York, you can be a citizen in Missouri. Well, their constitution is saying you can't do that. So Henry Clay forms a separate Missouri Compromise, and this is like the lamest compromise in our entire history. He basically gets the Missouri legislature to promise to never construe the offending clause in such a way that it sanctioned the denial of the privileges of the citizens. He couldn't get them to remove it. He just made them promise that they wouldn't apply it. So basically he's saying, I get your promise that you're going to lie. Which they're all politicians, so, it's probably not that hard a thing to do. And on August 22nd, or August 10th, 1821, Missouri becomes, too many twos, Missouri becomes 24th state. The Missouri Compromise is important because of that 3630. That line is going to be very important when we start talking about the sectional crisis, which is rapidly coming. Like I said, this is the era that sets us up for the Civil War. They do things in this 1810, 1850 time frame that is going to build us up to the Civil War. And, who knows, could they have done things differently? Possibly, probably. I mean, choices are choices, and they're human. You can change, you can make different choices, but these are the choices they make, so this is what we study. Another area where nationalism kicks in is in the judiciary. John Marshall is still the head of the Supreme Court. He's going to hang in there until 1835 or 36. I can't remember when he is out. And he is going to continue that Hamiltonian federalism in the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court is not supposed to be political. That was not the design. And if you read the headlines today, the Supreme Court justices are begging people not to see them as political, even though a lot of the judgments are going to come out and they're going to favor one side or the other, and that's just how it is. Whether they're actively trying to be political or not is where it comes up to open debate. Marshall, I don't think would have denied that he was pushing a certain viewpoint. He wanted to create, through the judiciary, a strong central government. We've already talked, excuse me, about Marbury versus Madison, which set forth the principle of judicial review. Fletcher versus Peck in 1810 was a similar case, and it also reinforces this idea of the principle of judicial review, but in terms of state laws. It's the first court case, and I don't know what the case was about, where a state law is reviewed for constitutionality by the Supreme Court. So in Fletcher versus Peck, he says, okay, not only can the Supreme Court decide on the constitutionality of national laws, we can take on state laws as well and invalidate them if they are not constitutional. In two other cases, Marvin versus Hunter's Lessee, which involves some loyalist property in 1816, and Cohen's versus Virginia in 1821 involving the lottery, Marshall extended the right to consider appeals of the state courts on the grounds that the Constitution the laws and the treaties of the U.S. could only be kept uniform if the court could review the decisions of the state courts. So now he's saying, we can review your laws. We can also review what your courts are saying. So if you get to the Virginia Supreme Court and you don't like how that comes out, you can appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court, which makes the U.S. Supreme Court our top court, which is what we all accept now. But in 1815, that hadn't been established. That's not written into the Constitution, that the Supreme Court is going to be the overall judge. Marshall sets that up. He also redefines the definition of contract rights in a case involving Dartmouth College. It's Dartmouth College versus Woodward. Dartmouth College predates the Revolution, and they had a self-perpetuating board. Their self-perpetuating board got sideways with the New Hampshire legislature. Like a lot of academia, they took a different view than what the politicians of the time wanted, and the politicians decided, we don't want our colleges teaching these ideas. We want to control what they're teaching. So they wanted, and they attempted to change the way the board was nominated to where the legislature would put people on the Dartmouth board. The Dartmouth board wouldn't just keep generating its own members. But that's not what the Dartmouth College charter, the contract that started it, said. And Marshall said the legislature did not have the right to impair that contract. This decision implies that the contracts are stronger than the legislation. And basically it says, it's kind of like that you can't be charged for something after you, like, if Shane threw his cup at Jalissa, I can't make a law that says, Shane, I can throw you out of class. I could throw you out of class for throwing your cup because that's disruption, but I can't make a law that specifically says Shane is guilty of throwing his cup at Jalissa because I've now made a law. They're saying the states can't change contracts just because they want to. The states also have to follow the law. And this is going to get turned around later when people start using contracts or the word contract in more of a corporate sense. And it expands the definition of a contract. After this, most states put in provisions in most contracts that made them, subject to modification. So it was an easy rule to get around. But if you already had an established contract, you couldn't change it. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it will have a valid effect later. He also strengthened the federal government in a case called McCulloch versus Maryland. James McCulloch was a poor little bank clerk at a Baltimore branch of the U.S. Bank, the Bank of the U.S., so he's part of us, charged with failing to affix state revenue stamps on banknotes as required by the state of Maryland. So Maryland has passed its own Stamp Act, in essence, which is not, illegal, as long as, that's what it goes through all the proper channels and you have representation. But The question is, can Maryland tax the federal government? Because by affixing these state tax stamps to the banknotes of the Bank of the US, even though it is located in Maryland, they're taxing the government. They're taxing the federal government. Marshall upholds the power of Congress to charter the bank and denied the right of any state to tax it. He argued that rather than the federal government being a creature of the sovereign states, it was a creation of the people. So Marshall says the federal government is not just a confederation of all these states. The states don't matter. The states matter, but the states don't create the federal government. What created the federal government were the people in those states. And he goes on to say that sovereignty was divided between the states and the national government, and the national government, though limited in its powers, is supreme within its sphere of action. So he's clearly stating that when it comes in conflict, if it is an area that is clearly a national duty, like creating the bank, the feds take precedence. This still happens today. I mean, if you ever, and you will, get a job, labor laws. The state laws apply until they cross over with federal laws, and then the federal laws win every time. And usually the federal laws are more in favor of the employee than the state laws, at least in Texas. But every time. He goes on to endorse the doctrine of the federal government's implied constitutional powers, that the line necessary and proper didn't mean absolutely indispensable. That you can do things that are simply convenient if it is necessary and proper. And he sets up the test. The test of constitutionality was, and this is the quote, "Let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, and which are consistent with the letter and the spirit of the law are constitutional." So basically, if the ends are within the realm of reasonableness, it's okay. The last area that he sets a precedent in and sets us up for a bigger government is Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. We will talk, probably not in the next section, but the section after, about all the growth. The 1820, 1850, there is this huge growth in infrastructure. And one of these areas is canals and river trade. So in Gibbons versus Ogden, Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston are given a monopoly in New York on the state's rivers and lakes to use steamboats. They're the ones who first start commercial use of steamboats. They, in turn, give Aaron Ogden the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey. Okay, so Ogden is running his little steamboat up and down the Hudson River, happily moving people and things back and forth. Thomas Gibbons had a federal license to run on the Hudson River. Ogden complains because Livingston and Fulton had given him their monopoly. A monopoly means you're the only one that can do this. Now Gibbons is running up and down the river. There's probably enough business for both of them, but people are greedy. He didn't want to share, or maybe it's Gibbons. I don't know which one. I don't know which one's plaintiff and which one is defendant. But the court rules that the state monopoly conflicts with the Federal Coasting Act. He stopped short of saying that the feds have exclusive power on the river. They just say you have power where it doesn't conflict with the federal government. And this is going to open the way for a lot of interstate development of steamboat navigation and railroads. All right, that's the end of the court stuff. And we go back to some diplomatic issues. You know, we did really good in 1817 and 1819, or 1817 and 1818. Setting up the boundaries. Well, we're going to have another round of that. You know, Spain had given up their claims to Oregon, and but Russia did not. In 1821, Russia claims the Pacific coast as far as the 51st parallel. I don't know. I'll have to go back. Sorry. So, it's one map, it's not my slip. So there's the 40th, there's the 50th. So 54 is somewhere around here. They probably climbed down to the Columbia River if I were to guess. That's right in that happy area that we're sharing with Britain. We don't want the Russians in there too. Russia is actually way closer to the U.S. than I ever realized until I finally looked at a map one day. It is really close if you go that direction. So in 1823, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams contested the right of Russia to any development on the continent, and basically says, we've got this. We're no longer a frontier. We're no longer unclaimed territory. You can't just come in and claim us as a colony. So they negotiate. Okay, no, I said that wrong. They wanted to go as far south as the 51st parallel. So 50th, 51st. They're claiming this territory. I'm going the wrong direction. I can't read the numbers. They're claiming this. We want them to stop here. Which does not seem like that would be 5440, but it is. We negotiate to that line, to the top of the green area. That's 5440, and that will be the southern boundary of Russia's area. The British signed a similar agreement in 1825, and in 1827, we agree again to continue to joint occupation indefinitely of the Oregon Territory. Indefinitely is not going to last all that long. We are going to want to kick the Brits out pretty soon. And that 5440 is going to be the fighting line, which is this, because that's where the border is now. The other big diplomatic move, was actually kind of like a non-issue at the time. Rumors were floating around in 1823 that France wanted to restore Spain to power over its old American empire. We don't want to deal with the French. We don't want them back. Really, all that is left of their old empire is whatever they still held, what Spain still had held in Mexico, which includes Texas. But we really just don't want them back. The British want us to go in with them on a joint statement of opposition. But they also wanted the U.S. to promise not to try to acquire any more Spanish territory as part of that agreement. And most politicians were okay with doing this, except for John Quincy Adams. He's the Secretary of State, and he says, no. We need to make our own statement. We don't need to come in riding on the coattails of the British. Makes us look weak. We were weak. We just didn't want to admit it. But, we need to make our own statement. So Monroe puts forth his doctrine in his annual message to Congress, the State of the Union address. And in this, he states that, quote, the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. So stay out. We've got this handled. We don't need any more European intervention, not just in North America, but all of the American continents, or both of the, North and South America. He states that the political system of Europe was different from that of the U.S., and the U.S. would quote, consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. We don't need monarchs. He went on to say that we would not interfere with existing European colonies. And moreover, we wouldn't interfere with European activities in Europe. We don't want to be part of your internal affairs or any of your wars. This idea isn't even known as the Monroe Doctrine until 1852. But it's going to have some very profound effects later. Like I said, this is the time when we really just start setting everything up. We didn't talk about the 1820 election because it was a non-election. I mean, it was an election, but Monroe won. There was no big to-do. But there's going to be a big to-do over the 1824 election. We pretty much killed off the Federalist Party. Everyone left. There are still some Federalists, but as an organized party, it's no longer together. So now we're going to have an election of one party. And it gets really, really, really ugly. The 28 was going to be even uglier, but it gets ugly. Everybody wants to get the nomination. Because pretty much guaranteed, I mean, the Federalists are going to put up a nominee. But if you win the Republican nomination, you're going to be the next president. So the players, Secretary of War John Calhoun wants in, Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford throws his name in the hat. He's actually probably, if you were in 1823 looking at, or 1822 looking at this, he's probably the front runner. He's from Virginia. It'll continue the Virginia dynasty. He's a states' rights old Republican. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. He's Secretary of State. They often get elected, but he's from New York, and he's very popular because he has negotiated a lot of these treaties and compromises that we've worked through. And then Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. Poor Henry Clay, he really wanted to be president. He really, really wanted to be president. And then you get this surprise person, Andrew Jackson. Jackson isn't a politician. Well, he has been, but he's not one of the main players in Washington at the time. But he's extremely popular. He's done lots of neat military things that have gotten his name in the paper, and people see him as a hero. He wants to be president. He actually, I think if I'm getting ahead of myself, he does and he doesn't actively pursue the nomination. What he says, and I'm going to paraphrase because I didn't write it down, was the presidency shouldn't be sought, but if nominated, a person shouldn't turn it down either. So it's like, well, y'all want me to be president, so I'll run. It'll be fun. The Congressional Congress had been a tradition. He kind of disappeared with Monroe, since Monroe had just kind of floated from one term to another. We talked about Crawford. Clay was pushing his American system. We talked in detail about that. Jackson is basically running on his popularity, and he's supported by Tennessee because he's from Tennessee. Calhoun was okay with being the vice president, and he runs under both Jackson and Crawford. And Adams runs on a platform that was much like Clay's without actually calling it the American system. So everybody has a platform, really, except Jackson, which probably helped him out because no one really knew where he stood. He was very vague. He was more, I'm a hero. You want me because I'm a hero. I can do this. You know, I beat the British at New Orleans, and I took Florida. I'm good. But because there were so many people running, the electoral votes get split. Adams carries New England and most of New York with 84 votes. Clay took Kentucky, Ohio, and Missouri, and some of New York for 37 votes. Crawford carried Virginia, Georgia, and Delaware for 41 votes. Jackson took the rest of the South, Illinois, Indiana, Carolinas, both of the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey for 99 points. It doesn't give anybody a clear win because it's not, you don't get to win just on majority. Which puts Clay in the position of president maker because now it's thrown into the Senate, and the Senate is going to decide, or no, the House, Speaker of the House. So the House is going to decide. Clay really doesn't like Jackson. Doesn't think Jackson's going to be a good president. Maybe more people should have listened to him. And after numerous votes, John Quincy Adams comes out the winner. There's a lot of backroom dealing. There's a lot of bargaining. But John Quincy Adams becomes our next president. Poor Adams. Okay, I should have flipped that already. This is going to cripple his administration. You know, you're running one out of what, 5? 5 people. You've just made 4 enemies. 4 very strong political enemies. Well, maybe 3, because Clay was the one who actually put him in position. Not only that, but John Quincy Adams was his father's son. He was aristocratic minded. He was distrustful of true democracy. He was elitist. He was not very good at playing politics. Like, he compared the presidency to the monarchy, which is not something you do in America. He compared it in a positive way to being a monarch. That's just like kind of a, just stab yourself in the face, type of a deal. It's not a good thing to do. He lacked a common touch. He couldn't relate to Farmer Joe, who came to complain. And he didn't have the gift of compromise. Not only that, which this actually to me is it's noble, but as a politician, it's deadly. He did actually refuse to play patronage. If, William was a good postal employee, but a Federalist, he wasn't going to kick him out of his position just because he was a Federalist. He said, that's wrong. He's a good employee. He's doing what he's supposed to do. So why should he lose his job just because he's on the other political party? That's admirable, but it doesn't win you political support. And that's one reason I couldn't be a politician. I would put my foot in my mouth probably before I even got out of the car. It just wouldn't work. But everybody accused him of being part of a corrupt bargain, and this corrupt bargain is he's never going to get past that idea. So it's kind of the end of an era. Ignore those last 3 lines. We're not even going to talk about Jackson yet. And I'll make sure if there's anything on the test about Jackson, I'll throw it out. This era of good feeling is over. And we're starting to get into an era that is going to be much more contentious. And we're going to start with some new parties. The Adams and Clay group will call themselves National Republicans, which will get shortened to, they're going to call it, which will get shortened to Republicans. They are economic-minded nationalists. So they're the big government people. Jackson's followers, and there were many, will call themselves Democratic Republicans, and they will shorten it to Democrats. But we will talk about them when we get into the next section and the Jacksonian era. So we are done with that. I actually got one whole section done in the time frame I planned. So y'all will have a test. I don't know when it is going to get posted today. If it's going to be after, it may be after 5, but it will get posted today. You will have till midnight on Sunday to get it done. Is that enough time for everybody? Midnight on Sunday? Okay. And then on Monday, we will start talking about Jackson, my favorite president. Yeah, that was sarcasm. Y'all have a good weekend. You too. Ryan. No, Ryan. I can't remember his name.
Are you